Now, raw format, I'll explain through briefly. I don't want to get too technical because it's something that you can find a lot of information online about, and I'm going to attach some videos to this week's assignment as well. But mainly I wanted to say that shooting in Camera Raw is ideal in terms of taking photography just a next step more seriously. Now, the idea here is that raw file images are uncompressed and unprocessed by your camera. So you're getting all of the original data that's recorded in your camera sensor to your memory card. The reason why many people don't use RAW as a default setting for their images is that it does two things. It makes a much larger file size, but in addition, it also isn't something that you can edit or print directly without going through some editing software. So today I'm going to show you how to process raw files after you shoot these raw files, and so we have some practice using what would be a better format of image for more professional photography. Now, something to know is that every camera shoots raw files, or not every camera shoots raw files, but most of our DSLRs shoot, and some of our point and shoot cameras might even shoot raw format at this time. But every camera manufacturer makes a different extension to their file format name for RAW. For example, I have a Nikon, and the files that come out of that are called .nef files. So we've been working with .jpeg, .tiff, .psd. RAW in Nikon, they call it a .nef file. Now, I don't want, again, to get too complicated, but many of you will shoot Canon, and what will come out of that will be a .crw, most likely. So just keep in mind that when we say RAW, it's not going to say necessarily .raw unless you have specific models that do that. Now, I'm going to come back also to looking at our classwork, and we have a file down here called Logistics and Materials and Workflow. If you open up this workflow document, it's a PDF, and I want to show you that the written version of what I'm going to demo right now is right here and starts with editing Camera Raw. So I'm going to assume that you've already brought your image into Bridge, and then we're going to go through this process of editing Camera Raw files. Now, I have my image here in Adobe Bridge. I've already downloaded this image. Now, if it's a .nef file for my Nikon, it's a raw file. That means it's unprocessed. You can see already that the file unprocessed is 40 megabytes just to begin with. If I double click this, it'll open up what's called Camera Raw. I can also select this right here called Open in Camera Raw. So if I select this, before it takes us to Adobe Photoshop, it's going to bring my file into what's called Camera Raw. Now, I'm going to show you this interface. This is your image. You have up here what's called a histogram, which is a measure of your exposure from black to white. Notice these triangles up here. I'm going to show you in a second what those mean, but I want you to activate those triangles, just as I did here, so you can see I've activated it, it's outlined. Now, here will be some readings from your camera, the metadata, and we're looking here at a menu of options. These are icons that will help us edit this image. Now, don't worry about anything else for right now. These are the basics I'm going to give you. Now, the first thing I want you to do again is to highlight those triangles. What those are going to be are measurements of your histogram and when something is in your exposure is clipping. Now, what clipping means, if I were to say artificially overexpose this, you'll see that there's red entering into the cloud area in the background. Now you can see this histogram jumps off of my graph, which is letting me know that there's clipping, which technically means that there's a loss of information. Now, one of the great things about shooting RAW is that we're able to recover a lot of information that may be lost in that original exposure, but is still being held in the data of that file. And so what the camera tends to do is try to correct and figure out what you may want. And so is Adobe Bridge and Adobe Photoshop. We're going to use Camera Raw to be very specific and tell it exactly what we want. So I'll come back to default here. The image looks underexposed right now. Now I'm going to show you this icon right here. This one, it looks like a what is technically a cross hatch of a lens. I don't expect you to know that, but if you were to cut a lens in half and look on it as a cross section, that's what it would look like. If you select that, I'm going to tell my program to enable a profile and remove chromatic aberrations. So this profile correction is going to determine and find my make, model, and lens that I used for shooting this image, and it's going to correct for any distortion. So you can see how it's changing that image. It's telling Adobe specifically what I photographed with the tool, and so it can get very precise to how I saw this image when I shot it. If this doesn't auto find what your make and model is, you have a ability to go in and find it. So get as close as you can to what you shot with, and that'll be fine. Now I'm going to come back to what is considered our basic settings for editing in Camera Raw. And what I like to do, I'm going to leave my white balance for now, and I'm going to go to Auto. I'm going to just see what it tells me it believes is a good exposure. Now what I like to do is I like to make sure that both of these triangles right here are as close as they can be to what would be black, which means there's no loss of information. Now this one's yellow right now. If I were to go in this direction, you can see blue is when it's clipping in the shadows, and red is when it's clipping in the highlights. So again, if I hit auto here, I can come up here and select over this histogram and drag it. So I'm going to drag from this corner over until that turns black. Now I feel like that's going to give me no clipping, no loss of information, and as much data as I can get in my shadows and highlights. And you can see already I brought a ton of information out of this image in the shadows in the foreground, but maintained all of my data and information in the sky. Did a really nice job. Now I'm going to then from here leave this alone. If you wanted to, I want to show you one more thing. If you wanted to tweak certain things like your shadows, your whites, your blacks, and your highlights, you can do that here. I want you to just see what happens. So if I grab this for instance, oh, it's not giving me that right now. It's just playing around with exposure. So I'm going to do auto again, grab here. But I want you to see what happens if I, for instance, lower the shadow. Come back. Right? That's what that does. If I auto here again, pull back a little bit, it's just revealing some of the shadow detail, the detail in the darkest moments. Highlights would be the obvious thing. I'm recovering highlight information because if I go the other direction, it'll blast out those highlights. Now, I'm going to open this image. When I open this image, it's going to open it up into Photoshop for me. It's a large image. It's taking a second. Now, once this is opened here, we're again back to our original settings where I can then process like I would everything else. So I'm going to duplicate this layer, I'll do some white balancing, I'll make some creative edits if I'd like, and then you'll notice that this says it's still a RAW file. So I want to make sure this is the stage where I go save as, and I'm going to save this as a PSD file here. So this is going to be an edit of that image, and I make sure that I save it as a Photoshop document. So one last thing to recognize is that if I come back to Bridge and I have this .nef file, which is our raw file that we've been working with, I want you to notice that up in this corner of the image, there's this little icon now. This icon lets you know that this image has been processed through Camera Raw, and therefore when I go back into Camera Raw with this image, it is holding on to all of my edits. And so when it opens up into Camera Raw here, you'll notice it held on to all of the edits that we had already made and all the settings. So it's important here to recognize that that's what we call non-destructive editing of this raw image. So I can come in here and change or tweak some of this. Say I don't like the white balance of this and I want to see what auto does inside of my Camera Raw. It's made it very yellow, not really what I'd like. Anyway, if I were to open this image, it will hold on to that edit that I just made. I'm going to back out of there, and if I cancel or say done, this image will open up into Photoshop as it did before, and if I come back to Bridge, again, it'll have non-destructively held on to those edits and reveal that that icon lets you know that that's the image. So if I had taken, say, 20 or 30 photos in this particular shoot, and I wanted to, maybe I accidentally changed the title of this file without holding on to the file name and number, I could always come back here and notice which one I had edited through Camera Raw and at least have a leg up on finding where I had left off.